Afternoon, I'm Jay Magaziner. I'm chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health in the School of Medicine. I'm director of the Center for Research on Aging. I'm pleased to welcome you and those who are online viewing our talk to the first Andrew P. Goldberg Memorial Lectureship, which was established by the Center for Research on Aging to recognize in perpetuity the life and legacy of Andrew P. Goldberg here at the University of Maryland. The center has initiated this lectureship with an initial contribution of funds from the center and two divisions in the School of Medicine that are in the forefront of aging research. The Division of Gerontology, Geriatrics, and Palliative Medicine in the Department of Medicine, which Andy established and led until he retired, and the Division of Gerontology in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health that I established and have led most of the time since its start. If anyone is interested in making a contribution to the lectureship, if you look on the back of the program, there's information on how you can do that, and we hope that you will consider that in the context of ensuring that this lectureship continues as we plan for it to do. The first lecture is very special in that we've called on two very successful scientists who worked closely with Andy and eventually moved on to prominent roles elsewhere. Before moving to our speakers, I would like to just tell you very briefly about the Center for Research on Aging that Andy was instrumental in starting. And here we go. So the center is currently led by myself. Andy and I started it back in 1997. And Alice Ryan, who is right here, is our associate director of translational science in the center. The center is based on the principle that aging research and training are inherently interdisciplinary and that care requires interprofessional cooperation and collaboration. We run this as a center without walls, in that we're really looking to harness the efforts of the entire campus and beyond in providing excellence in research in aging. There are 163 faculty from across the campus, and in the past year, the program membership has won about $74 million in new funds, largely from the National Institutes of Health, some from other places as well. And the mission is the facilitation of research and research training in aging. This gives you just a picture of the many programs that there are in the center, and this represents most, if not all, of the centers of excellence across the campus that do work in aging. And we've all come together and we've all stayed together for many years working in some semblance of order and harmony to accomplish the many goals that we've accomplished. And I think those that are here today are important recognition of that effort across the campus in many different places on the campus. I also know that we have many friends of Andy's and colleagues of Andy's who are online here, and we also have with us Andy's lifelong partner, Gail Goldberg, who's sitting up front. Gail, thank you for joining us. And my sense is, and I was told that two of Andy's sons, he only had two sons, so both of Andy's sons are somewhere out in cyberspace watching what we do today. That's Ethan and Justin, who I know he spoke about all the time about all their successes. So Andy really has contributed a great deal to many, many places. So the Pepper Center and the GREC, which I've highlighted here, are essentially the backbone of the Center for Research on Aging. They provide the essential research infrastructure off of which a lot of the research takes place. And Andy, when he came to the university, started the GREC in the VA, and some of those that are here are currently in it. Some were here at the very beginning. We'll hear from some of them. And he also was the main engine of getting the Pepper Center started here on our campus. So these were very prominent efforts, and we're very pleased that they have continued. We're now in the 26th year, and we hope that we will be here continuing this effort. Now I'd like to introduce someone who worked closely with Andy, even before he moved to the University of Maryland from Johns Hopkins, is Dr. Leslie Katzel, who's the current director of the Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center. And he will talk some about Andy and some about his contributions to science. Les.
Thank you and welcome. So I met Andy Dr. Goldberg in 1985 when I was a resident at the University of Maryland, and I did the geriatrics rotation at City Hospital. And I spent a month doing that, and it really confirmed my interest in geriatrics and gerontology. And then I applied for fellowship at Hopkins, and Andy being Andy, even before I was accepted to the fellowship, invited me to come over, and I actually met him at Levendale to talk about a grant that I should write before I became a fellow. Apparently there's a tunnel or something underneath Levendale, and he wanted to start an exercise program and wanted me to write a grant before I became a fellow. So it's fair to say that I wouldn't be here, and any of you in the audience wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Dr. Goldberg perking our interest in geriatrics and gerontology. So we'll get to the slide in a second. So very briefly, Andy was a native of Queens, New York, went to Science High School, and I understand his interest in medicine in part was prompted by his own experience in having polio. He went to Clark University, studied downstate, and did an internship at Kings County. He also served in a Coast Guard and did an expedition to the North Pole. I'm not sure whether the anecdote is true, but he made an emergency surgery on someone for appendectomy on the ship. I think that's true. So, man of many talents. Married Yale around 1973. They ultimately went out to University of Seattle in Washington, the VA out there. His mentors was Ed Bierman. So many of us have heard Bierman's rules, which are principles that he got during his fellowship. So anyway, he then went to St. Louis on the Schoenfeld. And then in 1983, he was recruited to Hopkins by Bill Hazard to help write a teaching nursing program project that we all were involved with. So this is the earliest picture I have of the group at Bayview circa 1988. There's Dr. Goldberg standing on the front, John Burke is in the middle. On the second row towards the right, more hair than I have now. I'm not sure if you're in this picture or not. I don't think so, but some others are already here. So that's the only picture I have of myself with Dr. Goldberg. Andy got recruited by Liz Rogers and Mohammed Abraham, who's sitting in the front row over here, to form a nucleus of geriatrics and gerontology here at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And he, along with Mohammed, were co-division heads at the time. And when we got the GREC, the Division of Gerontology was formed, which was subsequently renamed. And as Jay has told you, he was the founding director and instrumental in getting the GREC and the Pepper Center and later the Center on Research on Aging. Andy published about 200 papers. Traveled a lot, wine connoisseur. So there are many stories I could tell about Andy that we all had. So I'm going to pick one that I think in my mind, characterizes Dr. Goldberg. So as you know, Andy is not the best typist. He generally printed things out and wrote longhand on comments on papers. So the initial Associate Director for Education and Evaluation of the GREG was Karen Dennis. And Karen Dennis had 2 picture frames on her desk. So one of them was pretty prominent, that was Ronald Reagan, who was her cousin. So she had a picture of Ronald Reagan on her desk. And the other picture frame was a piece of paper. So why would she put this piece of paper on her desk? So what happened was, Karen was working with Andy on a manuscript. And you know, he would take comments in pencil and write comments. He would review it again, this time maybe in red. And then he would go on a 3rd time, because he wanted it perfect. So she ended up with this piece of paper that was totally crossed out. Totally crossed out, okay? And I said to her, well, why is this piece of paper posted? Well, she was very impressed that he spent so much time doing this in the first place. But she told me, look carefully at this piece of paper. So you look at this piece of paper and it said, good job. We didn't want her to feel bad that he put all in separate. But I think that exemplifies his pursuit of excellence. There are many other stories we can tell, but I'm going to have Dr. Ryan come up now as well. Thank you.
I wanted to thank everybody for attending this inaugural event to honor the incredible career and I'd like to introduce Dean Lavin, who just arrived. Thank you. So we're here today to honor the incredible career and legacy of Jim Goldberg. One of the reasons I thought a lectureship was so fitting was Andy's love of learning and going to talks and seminars. He enjoyed attending local and national conferences to learn about new areas of research. And Andy had this unique ability to ask thoughtful and insightful questions after every talk to the speaker and to help everyone, including the audience, think about problems in different ways. And he had a talent for linking seemingly disparate areas of research. And this talent, I think, led to his success in all aspects of Asian research. And I think Andy would be really touched that Rich is here today and Marianne today for the first annual memorial lectureship. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Richard Pratley, who served as the Samuel E. Crockett Chair in Diabetes Research Senior Investigator in Diabetes Program, lead at the Advent Health Translational Research Institute in Florida. He's also an professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Pratley is the international reference for diabetes, and he's board certified in internal medicine. He received his MD from Wayne State in Detroit and completed his fellowships in geriatric medicine and gerontology at University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins, and MIA. He's a member of the ADA, European Society of Diabetes and Obesity Society, and he's continued his active involvement in the professional community. He's on many editorial boards, including Diabetes, Obesity, Metabolism, Diabetes Care, Lancet. And he regularly presents at national and international meetings. He's conducted so many research studies on pathogens, prevention, and treatment of diabetes. And he's published over 300 peer-reviewed articles on diabetes and its complications. His current research interests include the prevention of diabetes, improving care of older persons with diabetes, developing new drugs to treat and prevent diabetes and complications, and understanding the role of fat cell in increasing the risk of diabetes and heart disease. Just as an anecdote, when I first came here, I was the first fellow on Andy's T32, and Rich was the first here. So it's my pleasure to have Dr. Pratley speak with us.
Thank you, Alice, for that introduction. I am. I have about the same facility with technology that Andy had. And while I'm doing that, let me just point out that I knew Alice before she was a Ryan. I knew her before she was a Dr. Ryan. So we've been working together for a long time. And I am just so honored to be here today to have this lectureship. And it was very special to me, as he was to everybody in the room. I would not be here if it wasn't for Andy. I don't think I would have had a career in science if it hadn't been for Andy. And I want to tell you a little bit about how his mentorship forged my career. And I hope this is the right one.
Did you unmute him?
Okay. So let's see. These are my disclosures. And we work with a number of companies that develop drugs for diabetes. All of the honorary that I get go back to my institution. And I also serve on the American Diabetes Association Professional Practice Committee. We write the guidelines for diabetes and also recently served on their medicine committee. So we're here not to eulogize Andy, but really to celebrate his contributions to science. I think that Andy has touched all of us, but more people than we can imagine in ways that are almost impossible to articulate. But you all are probably familiar with this quote. This is, "We are like dwarves perched on the shoulders of giants. We see more and farther than our predecessors, not because we have keener vision or greater height, but because we're lifted up and borne aloft on their gigantic stature." I think that tells a lot about how mentors like Andy take this protoplasm of fellows and turn us into scientists. But actually, Andy went through the same process. Ed Bierman was a leader in cardiovascular disease in University of Seattle, as Les mentioned, but he also had this cohort of just giants when he was a fellow. John Brunzell was his primary mentor, a lipid, Alan Chait, another lipid guy, Dan Port, who had so many contributions to diabetes, and then Bill Hazard, who you heard mentioned, who acknowledged but then understood the importance of aging and came and started a program here in Baltimore. So Andy was really standing on the shoulders of these giants. And notably, within a couple of years of finishing his fellowship, he had his first author paper in New England Journal as a result of these collaborations. But what I want to point out is that I think there's some other giants whose shoulders he stood on. And we're going to get to this. Wayne Gretzky, Billy Sutton, Vince Lombardi, Phil Jackson, and Charles Darwin. There's a reason for those folks. Now, when I first arrived in Baltimore, it was something like this. This incredibly old place, the Mason Lord building. I think I drove up in my 1940 Ford. It wasn't quite that long ago, but the campus looked something like this at the time. And this is where we lived, between the Gerontology Research Center and the B building, that little bridge that connected us. So the B building went on to house our clinical research center. I first met Andy in this tiny little office. It was stacked high with papers. Funny little man, very enthusiastic. And I didn't know what to make of it because I had actually come to work with Ed Licata. I thought I was going to be a cardiologist. I was offered a cardiology fellowship at the University of Michigan. So now I'm going to go do research in what we called at the time little old lady heart syndrome, which we now know is HFpEF. So that was my plan. And I got here and Andy says, well, we got this thing going on, we're going to do this program project grant, and we've got studies going on, in glucose and lipid metabolism, cardiovascular risk, it's going to be great. And I said, okay. And that was sort of the history. So yeah, I'm standing on the shoulder of a giant. And wow, what a view from up there. So Les already mentioned our teaching nursing home program project. There were many aspects to this project, but we were focused on the effects of exercise and weight loss on glucose and lipid metabolism in older adults, cardiovascular risk factors, and then we had components of pulmonary function, sleep, as well as cognitive function. This is really amazing at the time. The name of the program at the time was Fitness After 45. I mean, it's not aging, that's not adulthood now. Then morphed it to Fitness After 50, and it kind of progressed over the years. So the first Goldberg principle I want to share with you is from Wayne Gretzky. Skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. What does that mean? Well, this is what I think Andy and Bill Hazard and Ed Bierman saw. The world is aging, and the fastest growing population is those above 60. And those are the people that develop diabetes. And there's this progressive increase in diabetes throughout all of our age groups, but especially in the older individuals. So that currently about 29% of the global population with diabetes is above the age of 65. This is huge. We have, I think the latest numbers are close to 600 million people with diabetes in the country. It's growing astronomically, especially in South Asia, China, but it's a huge problem even in our country, in our part of the world. And it's a problem because of the complications associated with diabetes, particularly things like chronic kidney disease, which Andy studied and was passionate about, the increased risk for cardiovascular disease, a 2 to 4-fold increased risk, and heart failure, 2 to 5-fold increased risk. So this epidemic of aging, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease was really one of the targets that Andy saw 30, 35 years ago that he wanted to help prepare the field for. Now, the second principle is from Willie Sutton. You all know Willie Sutton, he's a bank robber, Slick Willie. He was asked why he robbed banks, and he says, because that's where the money is. So Andy went where the money was. There was money to be had in gerontology and geriatrics, because not only did he understand the epidemic, but also the government, the National Institute on Aging, the VA saw what the public health imperative was, and were supporting this. So Andy was continuously funded by the NIH and the VA for 40 years, something like that. And he did that by not chasing the money, but actually going to the public health initiative for aging and cardiovascular disease. Now, apparently, Willie Sutton didn't actually say because that's where the money is. He said he robbed banks because he enjoyed it. He loved it. He was more alive when he was inside a bank robbing it than any other time in his life. I think the point of this is you can rob a bank and still have fun. And I think you can't put the amount of work into the grants and things that Andy did unless some part of it was fun for you. So the second principle is go where the money is, but have fun doing it. So Les already alluded to some of our project teams. This is just a small number of the people who were directly involved. This is our close team. So myself, Les, and Jan were involved in lipid metabolism. Pat Kuhn and I did kind of the glucose metabolism. And this brings me to the third Goldberg principle, which you've heard before: teamwork makes the dream work. Or as Phil Jackson says, the strength of the team is each individual member. The strength of the member is in the team. And we were able to accomplish amazing things. We had, I don't know how many people come through that program project. They had glucose tolerance tests. They had glucose clamps. They had hyperglycemic glucose clamps. They had biopsies. They had an amazing number of things. We were able to do that because we were all working together on this common direction that Andy set. So he really built strong teams. I think that's one of Andy's strengths, is the ability to take, not recruit people who are fantastic scientists, but take people like Les and I, who are wet behind the ears, and turn them into scientists that work together as a functional team. So my role is glucose metabolism, and at the National Institute on Aging, GREC, I learned the Andrus glucose clap technique. Now, Ruben Andrus, you probably all you remember, was the founder of the clamp technique and also a mentor to Andy. This, of course, is a methodology that's used throughout the world to study diabetes and insulin sensitivity. And we did a lot of those in this teaching nursing home program. And I can remember my first thought about the glucose clamp technique, which was, it's awfully early in the morning to get up and start the infusions and things like that. But we did it regularly, and it was great. So the fourth principle is collaboration is key. This is where Charles Darwin comes in. His quote is, "The long history of humankind, and animalkind too, that those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed." So the teaching nursing home was a collaboration. We had our little group in metabolism, but we had pulmonologists studying sleep and lung function. We had neurologists studying cognitive function. When you think about it, 30 plus years ago, this kind of multidisciplinary, cross-discipline research was pretty novel, but Andy set the pace and set the expectations for doing that, because there was value in doing it. This is another collaboration that we had with the University of Maryland Department of Kinesiology. This is where I first met Alice and Margarita, or was it Margarita and Alice? I could never tell. We worked together. I did stress tests with them, and one of them would be taking the blood pressure, the other would be operating the treadmill, and they'd switch on me and I couldn't tell. It was very confusing. But we had this great program that looked at the effects of strength training in older individuals. And this was, I think, your PhD project? Yeah. Under Ben Hurley, and with the sort of mentorship of Jim Hagler. Now, Andy was integral to this collaboration. He and Jim worked together for many years, as he did with Ben. But it's an example of going outside of the box, outside of medicine, into another field where there's value in promoting health in the people that he cared about. So we had a number of papers from this program, a couple. We did the first glucose clamp. John Miller was the first author, in patients with resistive exercise, showing that there was a benefit to strength training on insulin sensitivity. And then Karen Koffler and I looked at the effects on resting metabolic rates and adrenergic activity in another paper. We had a ton of papers from that project. The fifth Goldberg principle that I've come to know is that success is hard work. This is Vince Lombardi. The only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary. We worked hard. We worked long hours when we were fellows. It wasn't always productive because, we sometimes had to fumble and find our way ourselves. And that was still a good learning experience. Andy worked hard. He would, as Les pointed out, he would edit manuscripts, and they'd come back to you, and then it'd be a third round of edits and a fourth round of edits, and eventually they'd come back to what you wrote, which was great. So eventually, after I was here at the University of Maryland for, I think, about 3 years on a K Award, I saw an ad in a paper, I don't remember which paper it was, for a position at the NIDDK in Phoenix, Arizona. So I did what any good doctor would do. I uprooted my family, who grew up here, took them out west, where they'd never been before, to start a new job at the NIDDK, the Phoenix Epidemiology and Clinical Research Branch. In the forefront is the epidemiology group. In the back is the Phoenix Indian Medical Center. And by an act of Congress, the whole 5th floor was added to this building, created clinical research center to study the problem of diabetes in indigenous people. So the Pima Indians, who lived just south of Phoenix, had, at the time, the world's highest prevalence of diabetes. This old slide shows their prevalence was about 45% or so. It's actually closer to 70%. This started in 1963. They were doing an arthritis study, and what they found was that the Pimas had an extraordinarily high rate of diabetes back then, about 25%. They came back a couple years later to set up a diabetes program. And at that time, about a third of them had diabetes, and it grew and grew and grew over the years. In the early 70s, they built this hospital, they established a clinical research center, and we started a longitudinal study of the pathogenesis of diabetes. This has been going on for a few years before I got there. People would come in for 2 weeks, they'd have glucose tolerance tests, IV glucose tolerance tests, mixed meals, have body composition, they'd have glucose clamps, they would have biopsies, they'd play pool. And, you know, it was a great group of volunteers. This is the DEXA scanning. This is our metabolic chamber, somebody having a glucose clamp with a hood over their head to measure substrate oxidation rates. And we got a lot of important data out of this study. For the most part, although the Pimas developed diabetes at a very high rate, pathophysiology was very similar to what we saw in every other population, so whites, Hispanics, Asians. And it was characterized by both insulin resistance, which everybody thought was the problem in this obese population, but also, importantly, we showed in this paper a marked defect in insulin secretion that started even before patients were pre-diabetic. And then as they developed pre-diabetes and then finally went on to diabetes, there was about a 90% reduction in this early insulin secretion. So my fellow Chris Beyer at the time was the first author on this paper. And you know, we thought it was a pretty good paper. We didn't get it into the New England Journal, but we got it into the Journal of Clinical Investigation. And you know, he was from Germany, didn't have much money, but he ordered 200 reprints. And so we got a call one day and said, Dr. Beyer, we really liked your paper, and we wondered if you had any reprints. And Chris says, well, I have a few. How many did you need? And they said, 100,000. This was Pfizer calling. And then subsequently, Novartis bought 40,000 from the publisher. Wow. This is one of our better selling papers. Now, the reason for that is because there was great interest in secretion in pathogens of diabetes and designing drugs. We also studied the genetic basis of type 2 diabetes while there. Very clearly, diabetes is genetic in most populations, but with very few small gene effects that remain in most populations to be well characterized. We also found that adipose tissue is an endocrine organ. So we were part of the first paper to describe leptin. And so it was expressed in adipocytes in humans and circulated in the blood. And we also did this paper on adiponectin. We found that hypoadiponectinemia was associated with obesity, insulin resistance, and hyperinsulinemia. This is also a best-selling paper, strangely. It's in the...
Rich?
Yeah.
I just got a note from someone who's in the Zoom audience, and the slides are not being advanced.
Oh. Ooh.
Now, I don't know, is our tech person here?
Yeah.
I just saw him walk in. Thanks, Artis. There it is.
So while we're waiting for slides, this paper has been cited close to 4,000 times. It's a hot seller. It's better. Yeah. So things are growing great for me at the NIH. We're doing good science, making discoveries, getting published. But I had 2 kids in college, and working on a government salary made it challenging. So the solution was to move to Novartis. So I got recruited to join Novartis to help develop drugs for diabetes. And this was in part because of our discoveries about early insulin secretion and its role in diabetes. It turns out that Novartis was developing drugs that targeted early insulin secretion, a drug called Starlix that was ultimately marketed. So we did a bunch of studies when I was there. We looked at insulin secretion in patients with type 2 diabetes with this mechanism and clearly enhanced insulin secretion. But more importantly for me, we did a cardiovascular outcome study. Now I'll tell you that at the NIH, we did studies, like 40 people or so, except for this longitudinal study. And we thought we were doing some really good research. We wanted to do this cardiovascular outcome. We gathered the statisticians and experts from around the world to advise us. And it turns out that we had to do about 10,000 patients in this trial. To identify patients with prediabetes for this study, we had to do 40,000 glucose tolerance tests. So we had 700 investigative sites around the world in 40 different countries. So my running joke, which is actually true, is that I went from doing studies in 40 people, studies in 40 countries. And this study eventually was recruited, doing well, waiting for outcomes, and they pulled me from that project and put me on another project, because that's what they do in pharma companies. So this project had to do with another developing area of diabetes called incretin biology. And it was found that there was a decrease in the incretin effect in patients with diabetes. And that looks like this. And basically what the problem is they don't secrete as much insulin in response to a oral glucose tolerance test compared to a euglycemic intravenous glucose tolerance test on the right-hand panel there, as do people that have normal glucose tolerance. So there's this diminished incretin effect that is not related to the amount of hormone. Two hormones, GLP-1 and GIP, drive this incretin effect. They're secreted from enteroendocrine cells in the gut in response to meals. And they're inactivated very rapidly by a drug called by an enzyme called dipeptidyl peptidase 4, which is ubiquitous. It's on cells, it's in circulation. So the half-life of endogenous GLP-1 is about 1 minute, and that of GIP about 7 minutes. So the concept was, let's make a drug that inhibits DPP4, you'll have more endogenous GLP-1, GIP around, and that will make things better. This actually works. This was the first DPP4 inhibitor in the world. Things like sitagliptin or Januvia was actually a follow-on drug to the work that we were doing. So it increased GIP and GLP in the circulation, and that in turn had beneficial effects on insulin, glucose, and suppressing glucagon. So the physiology was upheld by this mechanism. Because these drugs didn't cause hypoglycemia, we thought they'd be great for older individuals, and we published a number of studies looking at the effects of vildagliptin in patients with type 2 diabetes who were older. But as it turns out, working for a drug company is hard work. There are a lot of meetings. I had a team of about 25, half of whom were in Basel. So I spent half my time flying to Basel. I was on a first name basis with all of the stewardesses on Continental, or the flight attendants on Continental. And it got exhausting. So one day, the chief of medicine from the University of Vermont called me up and said, I'd like to talk to you about it. And I said, thank you, but I'm not hiring at the moment. And he says, no, I want to hire you. And it was just that right moment in time where I was exhausted from travel. I was realizing that if I continue on this project, I'm going to be having the same conversation week in and week out. Like, how's the drug work? How much are we going to make when we sell the drug? Who are we going to sell it to? And it was exhausting. So I decided I'd move back to academia, which fortunately I was able to do. So they gave me a position as a professor there. I set up a lab. We did clinical research studies. And it was great. Got to teach and have a lot of fun. Now, the other part of the incretin axis, we talked about the DPP4 inhibitors and vildagliptin, but at the same time in parallel, GLP-1 drugs were being developed. And there are now 6 or 7 of those that have been developed. And I've had the opportunity to work on lots of these in drug development projects. including this study that we published in, I think, Lancet a few years ago, which was a head-to-head comparison of a couple of these GLP-1 receptor agonists and demonstrated that some of the drugs are better than others. So this is another example of how we're able to move the field forward by working in tandem with the drug companies while not having to travel to Basel or Switzerland or other places half the time. Another study that I recently did was a study that looked at an oral version of this GLP-1 receptor agonist. This is absolutely innovative because, you know, in the past we haven't been able to give peptides orally. They figured out a way to give this long-acting GLP-1 in an oral form in doses that were enough so that you get the same sorts of concentrations in the blood as you do with a subcutaneous injection, and it actually works. It lowers glucose levels, and it works better than another GLP-1 receptor agonist that we compared to. So that was fine at the University of Vermont, except that Vermont is a small state, 650,000 people or so. It's a relatively healthy state, and there's not a whole lot of diversity. So a good friend of mine was setting up a research institute in Orlando. He and I had collaborated on some obesity studies, some adipose tissue biopsies, and things like that. And he said, you know, I want you to come down and look at a job. And out of respect for him, I did. Because my parents had retired. They first moved to Arizona and then to Florida. And I visited them many times. And there was no way in hell I was ever going to move to Florida. Thank you very much. Just trying to be polite. When I got down there, listened to the vision, I listened to the chief executive officer of the hospital. So this is an $8 billion system. It took an hour to tell me how committed they were to building a program in diabetes at Advent Health. And that was pretty impactful. And then I got out and drove around and I realized that, you know, once you get past the amusement parks and the convention center, it's actually a pretty livable place. So again, I moved my family down. This is our Translational Research Institute, which is now my current home. This is some of our program faculty and staff. We have 11 faculty members and about $11 million in annual funding, with most of it coming from the NIH. So our diabetes program covers the spectrum from both early pathophysiology to clinical trials to type 2 or T2 translation. This is one of my trainees. He was a postdoc of mine. I'm really proud of. He studied the sweet taste receptor. Turns out it's not just expressed in the tongue, it's also on pancreatic beta cells. We also found it in the muscle. And if you knock out the sweet taste receptor in muscle, these mice become athletes. They can go forever on a treadmill. It turns out there's a polymorphism in this gene, and humans have it relatively commonly, and it affects people's ability to train. So it's one of the areas of translation from mice into humans that I'm really excited about. George is now an associate professor at Ohio State. Another thing that we've been quite interested in is extracellular vesicles. These are little tiny things that bud off of cells. They contain microRNAs, they contain proteins. They're important in signaling from cell to cell. And they also can serve as biomarkers. So we've done a bunch of studies looking at these EVs as biomarkers, differentiating between normal glucose tolerance, impaired glucose tolerance, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and also type 1 and controls. So a big part of our program now is in type 1 diabetes. And we published a study some years ago, maybe 3 years ago, in JAMA. We did a 200-patient trial of continuous glucose monitoring in older adults with type 1 diabetes. Turns out that now that we're taking care of patients with type 1 diabetes better, a lot of them are getting into the older age category. And many of them do very well. They have some of the same problems that other older individuals have, but generally their diabetes is pretty well controlled. So we asked whether or not a simple technology like continuous glucose monitoring would add value. And it turns out it decreased risk of serious hypoglycemia by 90%. We've also been interested in treatment of obesity in type 1 diabetes. This is a thing. About 2/3 of our patients with type 1 diabetes are overweight or obese, not unlike the general population. And it impacts on their insulin requirements and it increases risk for cardiovascular disease. We had an NIH grant that was a collaboration between UNC, Stanford, University of Colorado, and ourselves to do a clinical trial of different diets in type 1 diabetes. And we also did some metabolic studies. So we're writing those up as well. Daria Gudisman, who is our postdoc, was the lead author on this study. We've got a lot of other things going on, including, studies of the microbiome. Another study we're just wrapping up is a R01 with a couple of collaborators from Mayo Clinic and UPenn, in which we looked at automated insulin delivery in older adults with type 1 diabetes. We studied other groups of patients with type 1 diabetes, and we've just finished a pharmacologic study funded by the Helmsley Foundation on a drug that potentially could impact on risk for hypoglycemia. This is one of our consortia that we have. This is a study that was actually led by a program officer that was one of Rubin's original fellows. So full circle. And he's now a program officer at the NIH. He's interested in pancreatitis because pancreatitis increases risk for diabetes. So we've got a clinical center going on with 13 sites. We're doing metabolic testing in people with pancreatitis. And we just wrote a grant to do continuous glucose monitoring in these people. So very early on, before they develop diabetes, to see whether or not the CGM could help predict progression to diabetes or need for insulin therapy. Now, the main trial is called the DREAM study, the diabetes related to acute pancreatitis and its mechanisms. And our ancillary study is then called the DREAM ON study. So I just want to point out, in full disclosure, no members of Aerosmith were involved in the preparation of the grant, nor did they provide any review or approval. We also have another UO1 grant going on in type 1 diabetes. It looks at impaired awareness of hypoglycemia. This study will also use advanced insulin delivery to try to improve glycemic control. And we're doing hypoglycemic glucose clamps to test counter-regulatory responses. We've got a bunch of things going on in type 2 diabetes, a lot of these clinical trials that I mentioned with new drugs. Importantly, we are trying to predict responses to interventions such as vitamin D and short-term insulin therapy using biomarkers that we're developing using EVs. The outcome studies, altogether, I think I've been on 7 outcome studies, maybe 8 in the steering committee, and these are changing the practice of medicine. So it used to be that diabetes management was all about lowering the glucose, because long-term we thought that was going to reduce the complications of retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and it does. And cardiovascular disease, that doesn't. However, some of these new drugs do, and the SGLT2 inhibitors are examples of that. So the study that I've been working on recently is a study called FLOW, which is a kidney outcome study in which we're using one of these GLP-1 receptor agonists and studying 3,500 patients with diabetes and chronic kidney disease. We learned 2 days ago that this study is being stopped early by the Data Monitoring Committee because of efficacy, which meant they had to have at least a 25% relative risk reduction in the primary outcome. So we're excited about that. Finally, diabetes in the elderly. One of the things I've been doing is taking data from all of these cardiovascular outcome trials, and there are now several thousand patients who are above the age of 65 and above the age of 75 in these trials, and trying to understand how this can lead to better appreciation for how these drugs work in older individuals. And it turns out that in all cases, the drugs work as well in older individuals, if not better. So there's a tendency in the past, I think, to say, well, older individuals are so complicated, we should treat them gingerly. If we're going to improve outcomes, we're going to decrease cardiovascular events, if we're going to decrease kidney disease in older individuals, we have to treat them with medications that work. So we've showed that in these trials. So these are just some of the other papers. Finally, I've been working in the community as well. 2 projects that I did, one in a Latino community and another in a historically African-American community near town, which are super gratifying and really feed into this whole program of diabetes that I'm trying to build there in Orlando. We have a pancreas biology laboratory that one of my young faculty members who's in the middle there, Dr. Kasu, has set up, taking donated pancreases, doing perfusion, imaging, islet isolation, stellate cell isolation, and trying to understand the basic biology in pancreatitis, type 2 diabetes, and type 1 diabetes. This is the team that works with me. So just in summary, I want to summarize the Goldberg principles as I see it. So skate where the puck is going, not where it's been. Go where the money is, but have fun doing it. Build strong teams. Collaboration is the key, and success is hard work. But there are 2 other principles. One is enjoy life. This is an important lesson that has only now been sinking in on me. There's Andy with his ubiquitous glass of wine. Andy and Gail 4-wheeling, I think, having fun. And you may or may not know, but Andy always has enjoyed his kittens. And I think this is in Africa. Andy and Gail adventure. And it's so important to make time for family. Gail was just telling me about a trip that they took year before last, to Churchill to see the polar bears. This is Patagonia, though, I think, isn't it? And my wife and I have been talking about that trip for a year, and I haven't done it. Yeah, I know. Gail is looking at me and she's shaking her head. Make time for family and the grandchildren, of course. We have grandchildren, and they're the light of our life. So I want to leave on this note. One of the things that Gail and family have done is establish an ADA Scholars Award, an early career award at the ADA for young investigators who are working in the area of diabetes and aging. So this will be the first year that this award is awarded. And I can tell you that there are already some talented people who are applying for this award. So this is an example of how Andy's legacy will go on. So certainly went on through me, it's now going on through my trainees, and it's also going on through the legacy that he's established at the ADA. With that, I'm going to close and thank you all for putting up with me.
He doesn't want any questions. Does anybody have a question?
Well,
Andy Goldberg needs, someone in here has to move Andy Goldberg. Ask
Okay.
a question. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
So the trial that was stopped early,
Yeah.
you said, was the primary endpoint CKD progression with an SGLT2 inhibitor.
No, this was a GLP-1 receptor agonist. That's what makes it different. So a whole new class of medications that could reduce risk for chronic kidney disease progression, as well as cardiovascular events that are associated.
Was the primary endpoint CKD
Yes.
progression?
Yeah.
And so
So-
they wouldn't have stopped it on the secondary, so that means the GLP-1s are probably improving.
Yeah.
CKD progression.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah.
We're excited. There was data from the CVOTs to suggest that there was this benefit, but those weren't designed as renal trials. So this was the first dedicated CV trial or CKD trial with the GLP-1 receptor agonist.
And so,
Conducted during pandemic, I might add, which is also.
so what do you think the molecular mechanism of the improved CKD is?
So that is a great question. There are GLP-1 receptors on the kidney. GLP-1 has a natriuretic effect, but the real answer is we don't know. We don't know. These drugs have a profound impact on cardiovascular disease. They reduce risk for cardiovascular events by 20 to 25%. Recent large trial in obesity suggested the same medication reduced cardiovascular disease by 20%. We have no idea how that works. We know there are GLP-1 receptors on the heart. We know that there are GLP-1 receptors in the vasculature. There are all sorts of pleiotropic effects, including effects on inflammation. It's a big mystery. but it works.
I was wondering with all the new exciting emerging research on circadian rhythm,
Uh-huh.
if you've looked at just like the timing of taking the drugs and daytime glucose excursions and.
Yeah, I have not personally done that, but we have a new faculty member at PRI who's doing that. She's studying muscle clocks. So we're doing biopsies on nurses that work shift work, and we're putting them in our metabolic chambers and measuring substrate oxidation rates. So it's fascinating stuff and clearly makes a difference.
Thank you, Rich, for that. So I'd like to introduce, Dr. Marianne, Shaughnessy next. She's the director of the, GREX, programs in the Office of Geriatric and Extended Care in the VA Central Office, that's the highest you can go. She is former faculty at the University of Maryland, School of Nursing, and joined Baltimore Rec in 1999 as postdoctoral nursing research fellow. And then she served as our associate director for education and evaluation for 10 years from 2003 to 2013. During that time, she collaborated with us here in Baltimore Rec faculty and fellows, conducting investigations in mobility and functional recovery after stroke. Marianne earned her PhD, MSN, and BSN degrees from the School of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania, and continued her academic education here at the GREC under the watchful eye of Dr. Goldberg, Dr. Mako, and many other colleagues and friends. And she joins us today to share a few reflections on mentorship.
Thank you.
I guess we can leave this up. I don't have any slides to share today because I was asked to come and share some reflections. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your talk, Rich. It was terrific. I was asked to join you today to speak briefly about mentorship and Andy's influence on my career and that of many others. And in preparing for today, I looked up the definition of mentorship. It's the patronage, influence, guidance, or direction given by a mentor. And a mentor is someone who teaches or gives help and advice to less experienced and often younger persons. It's clear to me that Dr. Andy Goldberg was a mentor to many who have come through the Division of Geriatrics at the University of Maryland and at the Baltimore GREC. Speaking for myself, I can honestly say Andy Goldberg was a significant mentor to me. While I've had several mentors in my career, none have had the impact Andy did. When I arrived at the University of Maryland as a freshly minted PhD in 1998, I secured a teaching position at the School of Nursing and a clinical appointment at the University of Maryland Marianne Rehab Hospital. My clinical and research interests were in stroke rehab, and I immediately set about establishing a professional network that would allow me to continue that work. A few months in, sitting in my office in the School of Nursing, my phone rang. It was a call from Andy. He heard there was a new faculty member over in the nursing school working in stroke, which was also at that time a research focus of Rich Mako here in the GREC. He asked me to come over to his office in the VA. I went to the meeting unsure of what was about to happen, but my research career was born on that day. Within an hour, I'd been introduced to Rich Mako. Andy, in his flurry of enthusiasm, had called Karen Dennis into the office to help me write a proposal for a VA nursing research postdoc that was eventually funded. And like Rich, I found myself sitting there going, yeah, okay. And now hearing your story, I'm wondering how many others of us did he pull into his orbit that way? Anyway, I completed that postdoc here, and then Andy selected me for the position of the Associate Director of Education for the GREC, where I remained until 2013, working with a very talented team of geriatric researchers and staff. And in that time, I had the opportunity to watch Andy continue his longstanding tradition of both formal and informal mentoring of residents, fellows, and junior faculty. I reached out to some of Andy's former mentees and asked for their thoughts and remembrances of his mentorship style. Almost universally, those who responded mentioned his use of Socratic method in scientific discussion. And for those of you who don't know, Socratic method is a form of argumentative dialogue. It's based on asking and answering questions. I'm sure that many of us can remember moments when we found his eyes fixed on us, and he would start a conversation with a question we knew he already knew the answer to. You only had to have this happen once before you recognized what was coming again. This would mark the beginning of a lengthy back and forth discussion, and one former fellow described it as arguments that would last for 3 days before reaching agreement. But while these discussions were sometimes uncomfortable, they were always thought-provoking. And I think what Andy was really trying to say was, this is interesting. You should think about this. This is something that you want to incorporate into your research. Inspiring others is something that every mentor should. And with that, we offer a few other things I think you should be able to expect of a mentor. A mentor should have expertise or knowledge and enthusiasm for sharing that expertise. Andy always seemed to know what was going on in the most recent issues of diabetes and gerontology journals, and of course, the health section of the New York Times. He'd come to work with something he just read and start a conversation with a few people or a small group and generate a discussion about what we could do here in the GREC to extend the science into new areas. His enthusiasm would sometimes extend to calling in the evening, over a weekend, or even during vacation with an idea that just couldn't wait. He looked for ways to get fellows and students involved. One former fellow said she learned from Andy that when I believe in something, I should uncompromisingly pursue it, and that being passionate about what I'm studying can be infectious. And I think you really agree with that. The next thing you should expect from a mentor is the ability to give direct and honest feedback. Anyone who's ever given Andy a draft paper or proposal to read knows that he could be counted on for this. As mentioned earlier, we all received drafts back with so much red ink on them they looked like they were bleeding. This could be hard for a fellow to swallow, but with each subsequent review, you saw less red ink. And at the end of the day, you had a paper that was publishable, or you had a grant that was fundable. He did the same thing with presentations too. When I became the Associate Director of Education at the GREC, I was responsible for coordinating weekly gatherings, journal clubs, and there were 2 times a year before AGS and GSA when Andy would say, it's rehearsal time. Every fellow that had anything accepted for presentation was going to get up in front of the group and rehearse their presentation, because nobody from Andy Goldberg's shop was going to show up at a professional conference and not look polished and professional. So Andy would sit there, as Alice mentioned earlier, and generate questions. He tried to think, okay, what kind of questions might come from the audience? He wanted his people to be prepared. That was part of what being a mentor is all about. Another thing you should expect from a mentor is an eagerness to invest in others. Fellows understood that Andy was willing to invest in our professional development. He demonstrated that time and time again with his time and with his effort. Reading the papers, the drafts at night, sitting down with us, pulling us into his office. I can't count the number of hours I spent at that little table, round table in his office, just throwing ideas back and forth. And somebody would pass in the hallway and they'd get pulled into the discussion, and then somebody else would pass. And this was the kind of mentor that he was. He wanted all boats to rise with the tide. One former fellow said, the thing I always appreciated about Andy was that I felt he cared. He cared about me. He cared about my career. And while we may have had disagreements about how to get to the ultimate end goal, I knew he cared. A mentor should also be willing to be a sponsor. Many of us were beneficiaries of Andy's sponsorship. He would be pleased to recommend fellows and former fellows for roles on committees, jobs, and leadership opportunities. I think he took a great deal of pride in putting his mentees front and center and watching their progression up the academic ladder. I can't even begin to imagine how many letters of support that man wrote over the course of his life. A former fellow wrote, Andy also did more to introduce me to others at conferences and talks than anyone else I have ever met. But he also watched us live our lives as we married, welcomed children, buried loved ones, and eventually changed jobs or otherwise moved on. And he shared in our accomplishments with pride. Finally, a mentor provides perspective. For Andy, that meant putting people first. He would frequently remind all of us that family is more important than anything. His office was always decorated with photos of his family. They had family photos, mementos from vacations, and once the grandchildren arrived, there were lots of pictures of them up all over his office. I should mention that after reflecting on these actions of good mentors, I realized that Andy's gift of time to his mentees must have often come at a cost to time with his own family. And on behalf of those of us who benefited from his efforts, I want to thank Andy's wife, Gail, and his sons, Ethan and Justin, and the rest of his family for their patience and their generosity, because he had a big heart and he shared it with all of us. That about wraps it up for me, except for a few closing quotes from former fellows. We understand and appreciate Andy's mentorship style better than we could in real time. In other words, a little time has passed, grown a little bit, and it's easier to appreciate the true value of what he imparted to us. As I get older, I appreciate the complexities of the man and his leadership more than I could on his spot. I did not always agree with his methods, but I can't argue with his results. Andy was gifted in mentoring and bringing out the best qualities in his mentees. Andy taught us a lot of things about research and science and life. And those of us who were mentored by him will always have what we learned and remember him with gratitude for the chance to know and love him. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for your great comments and some science, even though you said you weren't going to talk science. You gave us a lot of science. I'm not going to reflect on Andy. He was, well, except to say that he was not my official mentor, but he always had a challenge for everyone. And I had those challenges. I challenged him back at times. And we had to keep a balance going with Andy. So I think it was sort of the good cop, bad cop routine. And many times I was the good cop. He was the tough. And boy, it was a great partnership for so many years in so many ways. So I really appreciate that opportunity to work with him. So to help conclude our program, we are fortunate that the Dean of the School of Medicine, Dr. Mark Gladwin, who's the Dean of the School of Medicine and also Vice President for Medical Affairs for the University of Maryland, has been able to join us. And he heard some of the science, he heard some of the reflections, he knows where we are. And Dr. Gladwin, thank you.
I have the honor and the privilege of closing our first Andrew B. Goldberg Memorial Lectureship. And I really want to thank Dr. Shaughnessy and Dr. Pratley. You really elevated the stature of this lectureship and really set the tone of the bar for 100 more years of these to come. So I want to thank all of you that have joined us for this, and a number of people that have also joined virtually. I saw 35 people online there. I understand that we have other individuals that Andy has mentored, faculty that he's collaborated with, staff he's supported, and friends online. I also understand that his two sons may be online as well, that you'd stay awake. Thank you for joining us. And I want to, of course, recognize and thank Gail, who I haven't met, but I look forward to meeting you immediately after this, and thank you for your support. While I did not know Andy, now I feel that I do know him, so thank you for all those lovely reflections. But I'm obviously aware of his stature in the field and his incredible contributions in terms of our understanding of exercise, metabolism, and its complications or intertwined relationship between metabolism and obesity and diabetes. I also understand that even beyond diabetes, he really was an early pioneer in our understanding of exercise and how that could modulate not only insulin sensitivity, but cognitive function after stroke and physical function and frailty after stroke. And he was an early pioneer in the aging field. On this campus for 25 years, he really created to building the backbone of our aging research enterprise. He created with Jay the Center for Research on Aging, as you've heard. He was responsible for creating the Geriatric Research and Educational Center at the VA. We're recruiting right now a new center director for that position. And he was the PI for our first PEPPER grant, which continues now and has a critical role in aging research and training the next generation. We've heard how we're standing on the shoulder of a giant, but I would just reflect more broadly that at the University of Maryland right here, and all of us serving in academic medical centers, which I think are among the most, one of the best products of science and medicine and of America, that in academic medical centers, we are always on the front lines addressing the great generational challenges of the world. And I like to summarize what I think of as these great generational challenges, but Andy was a pioneer and leader in two of those. So what I consider to be generational challenges are how we're addressing climate medicine, a warming, connected world that's overpopulated and generating waves of zoonotic epidemics. And, that's a generational challenge. And on the heels of this, the emergence of antibiotic resistance. We have the epidemic of health inequity. And right here in Baltimore, we have an incredible role in addressing social injustice and health inequity. We have the revolution of brain science and the opportunity to confront the epidemics of mental health, mental dishealth, I should say, developmental challenges like autism that are still poorly understood, neurodegeneration, and addiction, which again is right at our footsteps here in Baltimore, where this last year we had the highest rate of fentanyl overdose per capita in the United States. And then what did Andy tackle? What I consider to be the obesity and metabolic syndrome epidemic. And it is an example of the impact of academic medicine on that epidemic. We're at the cusp of revolutions in science and medicine with the translation of Andy's work and your work, Dr. Pratley, to these SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 agonists, which are really changing the paradigm of treatment of diabetes and now showing that these drugs reverse HFpEF, reverse chronic kidney disease, and reverse cardiovascular complications of obesity and diabetes. And we'll have an incredible opportunity and challenge facing us. How are we going to make those drugs affordable to not just the wealthy people that want to lose weight for cosmetics, but the people in West Baltimore? And then the last generational challenge is age itself, the aging epidemic. And for the first time in world history, 4 years ago, more people were over 65 in the world than under 5. And that's going to create a disruptive challenge in how we deliver care. How do we develop drugs that maybe fortify our DNA as we age? And how do we address the changing demographics, the world of healthcare, and the opportunities surrounding that aging epidemic, the Great Tsunami. So again, I'll just recognize this pioneer and giant on whose shoulders you all stand. And I'll close with that. And again, thank you all for a lovely event.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gladwin. And with that, we will close.